As we prepare to come to the table, I invite you to read with me from Genesis chapter 22. Genesis 22. And I want us to consider what is among the most disturbing stories in the Bible. This is Genesis 22, and I'm picking up in verse 1, where the text says, "Now it came about after these things that God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, Here I am. And he said, Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac. Go to the land of Moriah, and there offer him as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, took two of his young men with him, Isaac his son. He split the wood for the burnt offering and rose and went to the place which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham raised his eyes and saw the place from a distance. Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey, and I and the lad will go over, and we will worship and return to you. Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so the two of them walked together. Isaac spoke to Abraham his father and said, My father, and he said, Here I am, my son. And he said, Behold, the fire and the wood. But where is the lamb for the burnt offering? And Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for the burnt offering, my son. So the two of them walk on. They came to the place which God had told him, and Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood and bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Abraham stretched out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not stretch out your hand against the lad. Do nothing to him, for now I know you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. Then Abraham raised his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him a ram caught in a thicket by the horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered him up for a burnt offering in the place of his son. Abraham called the name of that place, The Lord Will Provide, as it is said to this day, In the mount of the Lord it will be provided. Bible critics use this story to rant about the terrible God of the Bible. One critic wrote about Genesis 22, only an evil God would ask a father to do this, and only a bad father would be willing to. I think sometimes even we read a story like this and are left to wonder, why would God make such an awful request? The problem, brothers and sisters, that the critic makes, and sometimes we do, is to see the story in isolation and fail to recognize that all of the Bible is telling a single story of which each piece is a part, including this one here in Genesis 22. And I would submit that when you step back and understand the broader story, this story makes perfect sense and serves a vital purpose that intersects the meal that we are about to share. And so before we do, I would invite you to consider the bigger story. First of all, appreciate, as I know that you do, that God will often use events in the Old Testament for a foreshadowing effect. They look forward to what God is going to do in the future. We understand there is this beautiful linkage between the Old and New Testament that knit together this beautiful tapestry that is the Bible story. And that is at play in this story. We understand that our spiritual forefather, Abraham, was made critical promises in Genesis chapter 12. The blessing promise that through his descendants, a blessing would come to every family on the earth. And the key player in this story, Isaac. Isaac is vital to that promise. He is the first descendant that will ultimately culminate in the coming of Jesus and the giving of the promise of salvation to all of us. But then once we earmark Isaac and we start looking more closely, Jesus is all over this story. Did you see it? I even tried to pause periodically, wondering if you would notice the connections. Isaac's birth was an anticipated birth. That's one of the points of context that we mixed. Back up in the chapters that precede this in Genesis. And what's the story? It is the birth of Isaac. From chapter 12 all the way here to chapter 22, everyone is anticipating the birth of the child. There's this dramatic buildup to that moment when Isaac comes into the world in chapter 21. Does that sound familiar? How long have God's people awaited the birth of Jesus? His birth, too, was an anticipated birth, and a birth filled with drama. The problem with Abraham and Sarah is they were old. I mean, seriously old, well past childbearing years. They were left to wonder, how will we ever have a child? How will the promise ever be fulfilled? In fact, the story is filled with all of their efforts to try to fix this problem for God. It was an impossible birth. Does that ring familiar? The Virgin Mary will bear a child. How does a virgin bear a child? And then if you read back through this text, what you find in Genesis 22 is this phrase repeated over and over again. Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and take him to the land of Moriah, which some believe will bring them very close to the place where there will be another sacrifice offered in the future. And then what I think is critical in understanding about the stories is both of the sons are willing participants in the sacrifice. I think we miss that, and it's key. From my youth growing up in Bible class, I remember the flannel graphs of Isaac where he looked like a little 5-year-old running around. And so it is an awful image to imagine Dad bundling up the toddler, tying him up, and putting him on the altar and raising the knife. That is horrific to us, and it's just wrong. Isaac is described as a lad, and in the language refers to a young man, a teenager, maybe in his 20s. The language allows for a child even as old as 30. And then you have to remember, too, that Abraham is old, okay? Like 3 digits old. Now, reinterpret the scene. A man well into his 100s binding up a 25-year-old young man and putting him on the altar. Folks, that only works if Isaac is complicit. Abraham would never be able to overpower him and force this. The only way the story makes sense is if Isaac is agreeable with the plan of God, which reminds me of the words of Jesus. No one takes it away from me. I give my own life freely. And then as they walk to the place of the sacrifice, Abraham places the wood on the back of the son, foreshadowing Jesus bearing his cross. The wood was laid on his back. And victory is announced in advance. Abraham said, we will go and worship and return. And Jesus said, I will rise again. And then those amazing words of Abraham as he's walking along with Isaac. In fact, more evidence that Isaac is not a little taller. Isaac gets the whole sacrifice thing, right? He's walking along and he knows something's missing. We've got fire. We've got a knife. We don't have anything to sacrifice, Dad. And do you remember what Abraham said in the story? He said, the Lord will provide the lamb for the sacrifice. There it is in a sentence, ladies and gentlemen, the story of the Bible. How God provides the lamb for sacrifice. And so we get to John 1 and verse 29, and John the Baptist sees Jesus, and what does he say? Do you remember? Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. There is one critical difference in the story. When the moment came and the knife was raised and the sacrifice was to die, God intervened. And he stopped Abraham. And he provided a substitute. In the bigger story, as the sacrifice lays on the wood, and it's not Abraham's son, but it's God's son, he would not intervene, and the child would die. I have wondered if God intended that we would read Genesis 22 and be horrified by what was proposed here. Perhaps that we would grasp the enormity and the horror of Calvary. The price that was paid for our rescue. Peter would say, for you know that it was not with perishable things such as silver or gold that you were redeemed from the empty way of life handed down to you from your ancestors, but with the precious blood of Christ, a lamb without blemish or defect. So as we share the meal, let's reflect on the story of Isaac and be horrified at the terrible price was paid so that we could be delivered.